Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGDS. Certificate Program in Gender and Science, BGS 002 Gender, Science, Technology, and Society. Block-1 Introduction to Gender and Science. Unit-2 Gender and Science. 2.0 Introduction. Science is the rational understanding of nature and the human condition. Through systematic intellectual and practical studies of physical and natural phenomena, this understanding has transformed life on Earth, the Earth itself, and our view of the universe. The democratic and emancipatory aspects of science, its tools and applications, have been used to improve human lives. Yet, studies of the history, philosophies and practices of science have shown that science and technology, SANT, also reflect the irrational assumptions and prejudices of society. In the 1970s, feminist critiques of the humanities and social sciences revealed that knowledge production was not gender neutral. This led to the realization that SANT too are not free from embedded values and gender bias. Because of men's position in society and their access to learning, education and other patriarchal privileges, modern science has reflected men's interests and concerns about what is studied, who studies it and how. Women and other genders who do not conform to the prescribed masculine ideals, traits and behavior have been rendered invisible or viewed negatively. This influences the culture and organization of scientific institutions, shapes the content and methodology of scientific disciplines, and impacts all people's lives. Across the world, many believe that women and men have biologically separate natures that determine how people feel, think and act. In this view, separate natures are intrinsic, essential and universal to all women, or all men, determining their sexual and social roles. Some scientists have claimed that women's nature is responsible for their historically subordinate position in the family and society, and that it cannot be altered because of hormones, genes and evolution. Other scientists and feminists have refuted this, showing that women's nature is not innate and universal but shaped by changing social circumstances. 2.1 Learning Outcomes. After studying this unit, you will be able to learn how biological sex, sexuality and gender constitute human nature, explain the gendered nature of the scientific knowledge and scientific institutions, and discuss how socio-cultural contexts construct the gendered nature of scientific knowledge. 2.2 Human nature, sex, sexuality and gender. Contemporary research provides clearer insights into what constitutes human nature and the role of hormones and genes in shaping a person's nature. We now know that there is a complex interplay between a person's biological sex, sexuality, or sexual orientation, and gender. Like gender, the words sex and sexuality too can be confusing. Biological sex encompasses two categories, male, M, and female, F. Recently, the category third gender, TG, has been legally included in India. This is reflected in many official forms, like applications to open a bank account, where one must put a tick on M, F, or TG. In fact, these are not sealed boxes. Sexual categories span a spectrum of biological variations. Box 1. Box 1. Genetic inheritance. 1. Every human inherits genetic material, DNA packed into gametes, and passed on from each of the parents to the offspring. 2. Gametes, denoted by 20 for females and Xi for males, come together to create a new organism. At different stages of life, the genetic inheritance influences a person's hormones, anatomy and physiology. Biologists define two distinct sexes in many species, But that does not mean that all individuals can only be female or male. In nature, an organism may be both male and female, or neither, or first one sex then the other. The biological definition of female and male is not based on an essential quality that every organism is born with, but on two distinct strategies that organisms use to propagate their genes. They are not born with the ability to use these strategies, they acquire that ability as they grow up, a process which produces endless variation between individuals. Griffiths 2020. Biological sex is the outcome of a process from conception, through birth and puberty. Persons may be typical female or male or have various intersex conditions. Some may be female in all respects but have variations such as impaired ovaries and higher levels of certain hormones. Similarly, some males may have slight variations, such as in the sperm count. Those in the middle could display a mosaic of female and male biological characteristics. So, sex can be described as a spectrum. Some intersex persons, even those whose biology varies very little from the typical female or male, may choose to treat these conditions to conform to the typical, others may choose not to do so. Or their families or doctors who deliver the newborn may make these choices. Persons born a typical female or male may also choose to change their sex. The choices that people make depend on many factors including their gender and sexuality. Sexuality refers to sexual orientation, a person's emotional and sexual attraction to another person. Heterosexual persons are attracted to persons of another sex, colloquially called straight. Homosexual persons are attracted to persons of their own sex, termed queer/gay/lesbian in English. In India, homosexual identities are very varied. Hijra, Kothi, Panthi, etc. Bisexual persons are attracted to female and male individuals. Asexual persons are not attracted to either sex. Older children and adolescents may become aware of their sexual preferences before and during puberty, or this may happen later in their lives. In many patriarchal societies, including India, heterosexuality has been treated as the norm and any deviation from it involves a struggle against social prejudices. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, introduced by the British in 1861, prohibits sexual activities against the order of nature. After a long struggle by various people's groups, in 2018 the Supreme Court of India ruled that Section 377 would not apply to consensual homosexual relationship between adults. Sexual orientation is a continuum between heterosexuality and homosexuality. People at either end of the continuum may be entirely heterosexual or entirely homosexual. But across the span of the spectrum there are many variations in the degree of heterosexuality and homosexuality. This is further complicated because traits and behavior that may be considered homosexual in some societies are not seen as such in other societies. For instance, in India boys and men commonly hold hands. In Indian society this does not have a sexual connotation. In Western societies, however, men holding hands may be considered a sign of their mutual sexual attraction. Transgender sexual orientation may also be fluid and linked to cultural identities. The revered Jogappa singers of North Karnataka are young boys and men who marry the goddess Illam to become women. Among indigenous communities of North America, two-spirit people perform social and ceremonial roles. The complexity of sex, sexuality and gender makes human nature varied and diverse. Women and men do not have essential and distinct natures. The interaction between biological sex, sexual orientation and gender give every person a unique sense of self and well-being, and determine how their bodies develop and grow. Box 2. Bodies at work. The evidence is that anatomy and physiology may define the outer limits of physical performance, but within those limits all humans can develop speed, strength, flexibility and stamina through labor and practice. Muscle mass is developed by the stress to which a muscle is put, which depends on a person's socio-economic position and activities. Poor laboring women in India who carry heavy weights on their heads have stronger neck muscles than the men in their communities who prefer to carry loads on their shoulders or backs. So too, women athletes, like tennis players, javelin throwers, pole vaulters, weightlifters, develop atypical, so-called masculine, upper body strength through training because their sport requires this. Patriarchal societies, including many scientists, confuse biological sex differences with social explanations and are slow to catch up on current scientific knowledge. This is why such societies continue to assume that women's biological sex determines their physical and mental capacities, their very nature. The difficulty is that in the past these ideas were promoted by many scientific disciplines themselves. 2.3 Gendered construction of scientific knowledge. 3. The stereotypical labeling of male and female, masculine and feminine, happens in many ways. The language of scientific communication, particularly in the life sciences, requires descriptions of functions and processes. Scientists convey their meaning through metaphors and images drawn from the social sphere. Science also involves systems of ordering and classification and, most importantly, the development of theories. Gendering happens at all these levels. In 1996, sociocultural anthropologist Emily Martin Ford published a revealing study of the popular and scientific accounts of reproductive biology. She found that metaphors of the fusing of egg and sperm in scientific papers reflected the cultural stereotypes of female and male. The egg was most commonly described as passive and fragile, needing protection like a young woman. The sperm was described as active and attacking, like a heroic warrior coming to her rescue. Such descriptions are derived from the gender relations prevailing in society. Although new scientific studies of the biophysics of reproduction show that the egg and sperm are mutually active partners, many researchers continue to use the old imagery of the aggressive sperm and the passive egg. This reflects how deeply society influences science. Stereotypical imagery colors how we see the world. Ideas about the passive and subordinate female have also shaped the organization of particular disciplines. This is revealed in science historian Londa Scheibinger '5. Analysis of the emergence of botanical taxonomy, the system of naming and classifying organisms, in 18th century Europe. Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus, who formalized modern taxonomy, viewed biology through the lens of human sexual relations, classifying plants according to human marriage relations. Instead of using non-sexual terms, stamen for the male part of a flower and pistil for the female part, Linnaeus chose the Greek words andria for husband and gynia for wife. Classes depended on the numbers, relative proportions and the positions of the male parts. Below classes came orders, based on female parts reflecting the prevailing gender hierarchy. The class of monandria are monogamous, having one marriage partner. The order of polygamia are polygamous, more than one marriage partner. Orders were divided into genera, and then came species and varieties. The lower classification is still used today. Middle-class gender relations of 18th century England that viewed the sexual division of labor as complementary but unequal, helped to maintain gender hierarchies and make inequality seem naturally fixed by biology. The concept of sexual complementarity in the unequal division of labor continued into the 19th century. Feminist researches show that Charles Darwin too reflected the gendered ideas of his society. Biological anthropologist Linda Fadigan 6 reveals that Darwin's theory of sexual selection in humans was based on his belief that human males were more courageous, energetic, inventive, pugnacious and sexually assertive than human females. Darwin said that men had the advantage of size in early human societies because they fought to the death for access to women, and in modern times because they had to work harder than women for their subsistence. In Darwin's view, evolution does not select assertive traits in women, so women are nurturing, reclusive and altruistic, with maternal instincts for infants and others. Thus man has become superior to woman, concludes Darwin in The Descent of Man. 7. These stereotypes, the passive nurturing female and active aggressive male, seeped into the science of human evolution in the 20th century when accounts of man the hunter held sway. In this type of narrative, women in early modern times were said to be confined to the home, providing sexual and reproductive services in exchange for protection and provisioning by men. Small game hunting by women was described as gathering, while the same activity by men was called hunting. Contrary to the theory of man the hunter, there is considerable evidence that women's reproductive functions, pregnancy, childbirth and lactation, did not make them less productive than men. Indeed, women did hunt, besides providing food through gathering. In India, women hunters are depicted in the prehistoric rock shelters of Bhimbetka, Madhya Pradesh. A stone frieze in Udaygiri Khandagiri, 1st century BCE, Odisha, shows 2 women and a man battling elephants. Bas-reliefs at Hampi, 15th century ACE, Karnataka, of strong energetic women with bows and arrows, suggest that women did participate in hunts. In tribal/Adivasi areas, 2 women have been part of ritual hunting. 8. The apparent logic of gendered science masks many assumptions. As Sumi Krishna 9 has pointed out, when the gender power relations in the hierarchy of dominant and subordinate positions in society enters science, 3 interrelated threads of belief may be discerned: that genes produce particular behaviors, that certain behaviors are universal for all women and all men, and that these behaviors have become fixed through evolution and natural selection. From this follows the argument that the division of labor in society is functional and determined by biology. So men's productive capabilities are perceived as balancing women's reproductive and nurturing capacities. This makes it easier to sidestep problems of inequity and blame individuals for their presumed shortcomings, rather than question the assumptions and practices of scientific disciplines and institutions. In the 1970s, the entomologist and sociobiologist E.O. Wilson Tent claimed that biology favors patriarchy, men continue to hunt game, now represented by money, and that denying this would lead to loss of efficiency. He said, even with identical education and equal access to all professions, men are likely to continue to play a disproportionate role in political life, business and science. In recent decades, ideas about an inherent and essential predisposition in female and male natures have emerged in evolutionary psychology. Such claims, based on adaptation and genetics, to justify gender hierarchies in society have been comprehensively refuted by several scientists and feminists. Evolutionary geneticist R. H. Lewontin, neurobiologist Stephen Rose and psychologist Leo Kamen 11 emphasize that there is no significant human behavior that is built into our genes in such a way that it cannot be modified and shaped by social conditioning. Humans are not born blank slates. Yet, even biological features such as eating, sleeping and sex are greatly modified by conscious control and social conditioning. The sexual urge in particular may be abolished, transformed or heightened by life history events. Feminists have furthered the argument that human biological and social life are interrelated. Biologist Linda Birke 12 points out that while female bodies do bear children, the body is not isolated from the rest of a person's life. Bodily processes both affect and are affected by our experiences. Today, with more freedom to make reproductive decisions, such as the use of contraception. Even reproductive potential is more malleable. Therefore, gender is not an edifice built upon a biological dichotomy, sex. Rather, our experiences in a gendered world can themselves influence those biological processes. 2. For the gender dimension of scientific institutions. The process of doing science involves a range of institutions, an interlinked system of universities, national and international research institutes, professional organizations and government and international agencies. In India, as in many other nations, these institutions are largely dominated and controlled by men from privileged caste and class backgrounds. The relative underrepresentation of women and other genders in science is only the most visible aspect of exclusion and gendering of science institutions in patriarchal societies. Most scientists believe that they are engaged in rational, objective work, unaffected by their social location. Yet, the history of science shows that their view of nature and human nature is molded by their particular social experience. Science reflects its social context and reinforces it by valuing so-called male qualities of mind and rationality over so-called female qualities of heart and feeling. Moreover, high-achieving Indian scientists, who are predominantly men from upper caste, middle-class backgrounds, take their deep-rooted class-caste identities for granted and are unconscious of the social advantages that have propelled them into their positions. As educationist Meena Swaminathan 14 says, people who are convinced of their intellectual superiority are unaware of what has produced it, and sincerely claim to be casteless. She points out that upper caste, upper class male scientists who talk with pride of their lineage and family with a long tradition of scholarship do not see that those without these caste class credentials cannot be expected to catch up in one generation, even with support, which they rarely get. Women scientists who have to deal with their own struggles rarely speak out about their achievements or about discrimination, and are silent on the contentious concept of merit in science institutions. Merit is an instrument of marginalization that strengthens male domination of science in patriarchal caste societies. Feminist mathematician Jayashree Subramanian '15 research has revealed the many ways in which this happens. Men scientists doubt women's competence and commitment and attribute women scientists' achievements to hard work rather than talent. For science, women are often excluded by assuming that they will leave science to care for their families. Women are also unable, for many social reasons, to establish the personal connections and collaborations that are necessary to further scientific research. There may not be overt inequity, but all those who do not conform to the masculine ideals of science face everyday discrimination and subtle forms of harassment. When does a woman's contribution gain recognition as knowledge or as being significant in building up a profession? Asks Mandira Sen 16, writing about Ajita Chakraborty, India's first practicing woman psychiatrist. Box 3. Chakraborty remains largely unrecognized, but her ideas resonate with women's critiques of medical and mental health practice today. Box 3. Establishing a discipline. Ajita Chakraborty came from a privileged background and trained in Britain. She joined the West Bengal Government Health Service in 1960, and her career was contiguous with the formation and growth of the discipline of psychiatry in India. She was an uncompromising woman with strong views that ran counter to the discipline that was being established. She fought marginalization at every step. Chakraborty argued that academic psychiatry was so strongly biological and medical that it was almost devoid of social and human dimensions. For a new orientation to emerge, she felt, There had to be greater awareness of the local experience and cultural context. This was especially important for women. She held that mental illness may be caused by biological factors but was manifested through language and non-verbally in a particular social context. Indeed, the success of aspiring scientists from conventionally excluded backgrounds who clear the merit gateway and forge a scientific career lies in their ability to negotiate spaces in the institutional structure and culture of science. Their presence does not necessarily change the culture of the institution or of the science. As biologist Evelyn Fox Keller 17 argued, for women scientists as scientists, the principal point is that measures of scientific performance admitted of only a single scale, according to which to be different was to be lesser. Under such circumstances, the hope of equity, indeed the very concept of equity, appeared, as it still appears, to depend on the disavowal of difference. Assume gender-based difference is the basis both for women being excluded from science and for women scientists being viewed as somehow not being womanly, feminine. 2.5 Summary Today, science is a collaborative effort, but the public perception of science, fostered by the media, largely centers on individually successful and usually privileged male scientists. The star renders invisible the large numbers of other scientists and technicians in the background, including women. In India, casual observation shows a swift rise in the number of women technicians, such as pharmacists, opticians, laboratory workers, but there's little data on this trend. From experience in other workspaces, we know that the number of women in an institution does bring about change, at the very least in practical facilities, the availability of washrooms, the height of a lectern, the provision of creches, etc. A critical mass of women colleagues may also provide a support system against some forms of workplace harassment. There have been many well-intentioned programs to encourage girls to study science and for women to choose and remain in scientific careers. This is an important goal, but initiatives continue to be grounded in dual norms and a hierarchical characterization of women's and men's work. Gains in enrollment are not maintained at higher stages of education and employment. We now need to move beyond numbers to address the gendered attitudes of scientists, the gendering of scientific knowledge, and the underlying assumptions in the deep structures of scientific institutions and practices. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.